My name's Andrew Walker. Like the man said, I'm with GameFounders. I'm the COO. We've just opened our new offices in Malaysia. So we're newcomers to Southeast Asia. So it really is my pleasure and honor to welcome some experts on the territory. There's been a lot written lately about the opportunities that are either here now or are coming down the line in Southeast Asia. And you know, I did a little research before, and we did a whole tour, in fact, earlier in the year. And we always quote, as everybody, I think, it talks about Southeast Asia, they quote the Natsuume report, which has a lovely, you know, hockey stick graph, which talks about a 28.8 CAGR growth each year. And then when I was Googling, I found this other report by Frost and Sullivan, who I'd never heard of, where they talk about almost 50% growth year on year, and they list some of the reasons why. But I'm here to talk to the experts as to why they may agree or disagree, and look at what the problems and the challenges are in being a success in the Southeast Asian region. I would like just to start by offering our esteemed panelists a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Henry. I am the GM of, MD, sorry. Managing Director of Gumi Asia. We are based in Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia, but we publish in the region and to the west, meaning EFIGs, North America, looking into Latin America, and we're a public listed company in a Tokyo Stock Exchange.
I am Jakob Lykkegaard. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Playlab. We have a studio in Bangkok and in Philippines as well. Our focus has been very much on the Western markets, but we also started now looking for other developers in Southeast Asia that we can actually bring to a global crowd. And then also within the next few years, we start publishing more into Southeast Asia, since it's growing so much right now, and we are based there anyway.
Hi, I'm Chris Natsuume. I'm one of the co-founders of Boomzap. We're one of the older independent developers in Southeast Asia. We've been around about 10 years. We have historically been using Southeast Asia as a base to build games to ship out to the rest of the world, but we're increasingly looking at Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia, as a primary market for our products as well. We've got people in, I forget how many countries, but every major country in Southeast Asia.
My name is Mario Wynands. I'm the Managing Director of PikPok, which is a developer and publisher based out of Wellington in New Zealand. Like the others, we're primarily focused on the Western higher value markets, but we've been seeing a lot of growth in our user base out of Southeast Asia over the last couple of years, and really starting to try and capitalize on that now and see what we can, what kind of success we can get out of that market.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So let me just start with a very top level question. Why is Southeast Asia so important as a gaming market? Let's put growth out to one side for a second. What's the significance of this market to you as a developer or as a publisher?
So I would say there's 650 million people in Southeast Asia. And where I like the market is that it's actually been neglected for so long that they have a very mixed taste of Western games and also the more northeastern Japanese, Chinese games. But it's really interesting because the smartphone penetration, everything is like growing crazy there, and you have currently just as many downloads as you would have in Korea, but there's so much more potential as the market get in with the GDP growing, smartphone penetration, and all those points. It's just a must-have market, and also since there's less competition on the market right now, if you get in right now and kind of own the market, you will follow the growth following on.
Yeah, I think to add to that, you know, one of the great things about the culture and the way people work generally in that region is a lot of their entertainment, what they do, their social media, it's all being driven through their phone rather than you know, higher spec PCs or anything like that. So there's a real opportunity where people are driving so much attention into their phones, and it's a precious piece of tech to them. So you know, the hard bit to crack is how to monetize it. Yeah.
We look at it, besides the potential consumer market, we look at it at a more specific level. One is one of our service center, customer supports in Manila, partly because it's historically known for a BPO, like a call center, similar to India. So we take advantage of that country's English speaking, able to deal with a lot of submissions for UA in English. And then, of course, we do a lot of artwork out of Indonesia because they tend to be pretty good at it for various reasons. And then we tap into some developers in Vietnam. So that's an example where we sort of try to take the best of breed or best practices of each region and sort of gel it together.
I think one of the things to think about Southeast Asia is if we look historically back at the markets in the West, Angry Birds is a really good example. One of the core successes of Angry Birds is it happened to be timed with the release of certain pieces of hardware, and it was one of the top titles when a lot of people got their first smartphones or their first smartphone of that generation. And when we look at Southeast Asia, we're talking about a whole region of the world that's getting their very first computing device. And as Mario said, it's not just their first smartphone, it's their first computing device ever. They've never owned a computer. The closest thing to a computer they've ever owned was you know, one of these Nokia phones. And so there's the opportunity for people who are getting in now to be the title that they remember as the first game that they played on their own device. And that's a very exciting opportunity that doesn't exist in much of the world right now.
I'm hearing a lot about brand building and maybe what might be called, not maybe virgin territories, maybe the wrong word, but at least there's the lack of competition. Are you seeing brands being built across the region that are maybe less known in the West?
I mean, if you were to look at the top 10 titles in the major parts of Southeast Asia, it looks a lot like a mix of the top 10 titles in China, Japan, and the West. So Clash of Clans is there. You know, some of the titles you would expect are there. There aren't a lot of homegrown titles there yet. And I think that's one of the sort of misunderstandings that people have about Southeast Asia. If you go talk to some Southeast Asian experts and say, like, you know, do I need to translate my game into Indonesian? A lot of them will say, oh no, you don't need to bother because all the top titles haven't been translated into Indonesian. And it's sort of a, well, yes, the top titles are not in Indonesian because nobody's bothered to translate them into Indonesian. So,
290 dialects of Indonesian as well?
Well, but there's one that most of them speak. So, you know, it's the same in the Philippines. There's 40 languages in the Philippines, but most people speak, you know, Taglish. So it's a very strange place in trying to understand what's local and what's not local.
But everybody talks about it as like a region, Southeast Asia. But what about the individual countries within those regions? Are there individual quirks or individual characteristics of those countries that make it more difficult to consider it as a region, or is it really that uniform?
It is not.
Please.
If I should see countries sticking out, it's of course Singapore sticking out. The numbers you see from there are very similar to a Western market, but it's a small population. Second market would be Vietnam, because I know they don't like to be called it, but I call it like, I see a little bit the same trends as I see in China, where you have your very own payment systems, you have games that are created by Vietnamese company for the Vietnamese markets. The rest of the markets, as I said before, I like to call them neglected, because there are very individual distinguishes between the different countries, but you can't point at a game and say, that's a very Thai game, that's a very Malaysian game. And the reason you can't do that is maybe because people actually haven't focused enough on the market yet, because the potential is there, but they haven't, like, numbers are not there yet. So I think we will, over the next 3 to 5 years, actually see more distinctions between the different countries. There is a few examples you can mention now, but I think it's very limited.
I would also argue that you have to look at platform differences. One of the big ones in terms of getting your stuff out there virally is, who uses Facebook, who uses Line. If you're in Thailand, you're in Line country, right? If you're in Indonesia, a lot of people don't know that's actually one of the largest markets for cacao. Right? And a lot of people don't know that, but they also use a lot of Line. If you go to the Philippines, it's all about Facebook. And so you have those differences are going to change your marketing plans country by country. And certainly once you start looking at stuff that's linguistically different, then you get into a lot of different marketing opportunities. I would say the level of difference between the countries in Southeast Asia is very similar to the level of difference between countries in Europe. And I think it's a pretty good analogy to say, the marketing changes that you would do between the UK and Germany, that level of change is probably appropriate for, or specialization would be appropriate in between Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. I think it's probably at least that different.
One unusual tidbit is, I lived in all those countries, is for example, a lot of the social gaming companies like Playtika, Slotmania are doing fantastically well in Indonesia and Malaysia, which are Islamic countries. And then they would get local celebrities to endorse, instead of Slot of Cleopatra, it'd be the local star. So the point of that story is it is sometimes the region so fragmented that it's not always intuitive. So you got to really delve into the local markets.
Yeah, I guess for us, looking from the outside, we definitely understand that there are differences, but it's hard for us to understand the differences. We have some games that do really well in Vietnam, but not so well anywhere else in Southeast Asia. So we're still feeling our way around that. What we've found, though, that has been very important that Chris touched on before, is the importance of localization. And the more we support the various languages, we've found that the greater the uptake has been, not only because of the improved usability for the consumers, but also we're finding we're getting more and more attention from the local app store managers as well, giving us more featuring. And that's actually something that's quite important, no matter where, which country in the world. There are a lot of sort of second-tier countries that have specific feature categories that are localized. These games have been localized into the local language. So that's really helped us there as well.
Is there, just to go on that point, is there a fair analogy, being old enough that I remember the box product days, that there was always a decision made whether to localize box and docks or localize the whole product? Is there an analogy that you're seeing the fully localized content has much greater potential than just, if you like, localizing the title and description into English? Is that a fair analogy, or is that not even touching that?
I mean, I can tell you what Apple's advice to us is, which is, the order of importance is, at least get the App Store description and any call-outs on the assets localized. The box. And then if you can do the menus within the game and kind of the high-level stuff, and then if you can afford it and can your tech and you have the time, do all of the the narrative content or whatever else you might have in there. So so the more you can localize, the more the platform manufacturers and those local editors and curators will give you back that love.
And just to add one more important step in that, also your advertisements, because your CPI prices will go down quite a lot by actually even using any local language Thai to convert into the actual app page. And of course that's converted, you will convert them into downloads. And I feel it less in the games, unless you have a very story-driven games part, because most languages most languages understand, play, and continue, and everything today is so visual on those parts.
I will say there's one danger as well, and at the risk of being politically incorrect here, a lot of people in Southeast Asia have seen local product as being inferior product historically. And so when we started putting together localizations for the Philippines, for instance, a lot of people were like, ooh, don't put it in our language, that'll make it look cheap, right? We see foreign stuff as being of higher quality. Yeah, and that was the original sort of feedback that we got. But when we started actually doing because it's not just localizing the language, it's not just changing it so they understand it, but it's actually changing the jokes to be local language jokes. And when we got deep into our localization and had people really do that work, then we got a great response. And we took it to some conventions, and people in the Philippines were like, oh wow, nobody's ever done something that really had our sense of humor before. But just putting it sort of, going halfway and just kind of hiring somebody to do the language and not do the full regionalization of it, it runs the danger of looking cheap. And there's a weird gray area in there that we're still testing, actually.
It's funny, with the Tagalog, it's more, I would probably go out and take your English descriptions and translate some of the words into Tagalog.
Well,
because
if you would get a Filipino to do
exactly,
that for you.
You wouldn't do that yourself,
yeah.
But the way you read everything on Facebook, everything on news sites, yes. Half of it is English and the other half is Tagalog. It's a mixed language in those parts.
And a lot of people have tried to translate into Tagalog, right? And they've gone and hired somebody to do everything in Tagalog. Yeah. And then Filipinos look at it and they're like, that doesn't look like any entertainment product we ever got. That's wrong. But if you listen to Filipino TV or radio, it's just like he says. It's like half English, half Tagalog. But that's something that only a native speaker, who's not just a native speaker, but someone who's good at writing entertainment text, would know or understand or do properly. And that's the level of getting involved that you need to get. And that's not cheap, and it's not easy, and it's not fast.
Just to add one more example to that. One of the big pushes that we did after releasing our Rival Stars basketball game in October last year, we did a big push into Asia in general, and added, at that time, a number of the Southeast Asian languages. But we actually also added a lot of players. We created more base 3D models that had different, racial characteristics from around Asia and Southeast Asia, and created actual players that you could collect that were from and had obvious Vietnamese names and Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and that was actually something that not only helped us with Apple in particular and getting us different feature spots and getting those localized into local language categories, but we saw a great response from players as well, and actually people who posted up on Facebook, and it's like, hey, this game's now got a Vietnamese player in it. That's cool. So that was actually something, going beyond just text translation and actually representing the local people within the content of the game, got us traction not only with Apple but with consumers as well.
So that's interesting. What marketing tactics work specifically in the region more than others? So you've talked about, obviously local celebrities that work well. What about other tactics that are maybe more that might surprise a European developer that works well in the region?
I mean, let's start with talking about the elephant in the room, which is these are poor countries, right? When you start expanding into, people like to say there's 250 million people in Indonesia. Yeah, a lot of that 250 million people in Indonesia earn like $200, $300 a month, right? And so when we start talking about traditional European marketing tactics of, if the LTV is greater than, when you start doing that math with a user that earns $200 a month, there's only so high that's going to get, right? There's only so much money you get out of that person. So when we talk about marketing, one of the biggest challenges that we've faced is how do we fight that math of there's just only so much these users are going to be worth because there's only so much money they have. So I think for a European coming in and being used to, I can buy users at $4 and still make it make sense, there's not a lot of users in Southeast Asia worth $4. I mean, that's just God's honest truth. And I don't know that there's anything the industry can do about that. So I mean, we should get that out straight off the hook. But there are some, and you can target those. but not when people like to throw out the 250 million Indonesians number. Yeah, not most of them.
Because to add to that, the whales that we see in some of the countries, especially in, for example, Thailand and those parts, remember that yes, it is pure countries, but you also have a lot bigger span between the different parts of the population, meaning that we have whales in Thailand spending the same amount of money as some of our whales in, not allowed to say whales anymore, big spenders. Our big spenders,
Premium users.
premiums, big spending users in Thailand are spending as much money as premium big spending users in US. The conversion rate to get to those is just a lot smaller. Yeah. So also remember to work with live operations in it, because even though all the games that are in the top charts in Southeast Asia, most of the most downloaded ones are Western games, but in live operations like that, originally probably came out of Japan and China, where you're really used to having these weekly tournaments, the special things, special characters, and all those parts. You can really monetize well with that in Southeast Asia, because the other part of the game are Japanese, Chinese translated games into Southeast Asia. They do a lot of the live operations. They do push a lot in it as well. I know Gumi is doing a great job in that, of actually remember that once you actually have the big spending users in, to also keep them happy and keep them spending in the game.
There's only so many of them. You can't lose them.
Yeah.
To answer the tactical question for marketing, it's a relatively poor region, of course. It's very hot compared to San Francisco. And a lot of the cultures revolve around malls, like KLCC. I mean, it's hot. You want to be in a mall, that's for sure. And we've done a lot of promotions where you get, quote, not to be sexist, but like promo girls to get people to download. And then you use the local Wi-Fi. Data is very expensive. And you would incentivize the promo people to 10 cents a download, but that in essence saves you on, we use UA as well, but that's a very good tactic. The other point that all of that is a lot of handsets are very underpowered. So besides Samsung, LG, HTC, you need to focus on a lot of those Chinese devices. And again, you need to download via Wi-Fi and not cell network. So you need to look at Coolpad, Lenovo, Huawei ZTE, Cherry Mobile, like the local branded OEMs as well. So before you do the localization, you got to make sure the games run on those low-end phones, which would be more than 50%, but unfortunately revenue might still be 20%. But you still need to service those, so that'd be one thing you should keep in mind.
Size.
Yeah, oh yeah, the most obvious. I mean, it's like 10 years or 5 years ago, it should be like 5 megs, 25 megs, or you need to have a downloader of some sort to go back to a Wi-Fi network to download the 100 meg. But anything like, some of our games are just like 1 gig. That's just not really workable.
And Wi-Fi just isn't as common. Wi-Fi just isn't as common as it is here, for instance, or
it probably is. It's just a lot more slow.
Okay.
Actually, it's surprising. I come back from Southeast Asia and come to America, and I'm like, oh my God, America has the worst fucking internet in the world, because they've had to deal with poor internet. So I mean, they all have 3G, but they don't want to burn through their data plans on the 3G. But every single store in Southeast Asia has Wi-Fi because there's an air conditioner and Wi-Fi. And that's the social experience in Southeast Asia, is to go where the air conditioning and the Wi-Fi is.
Well, so am I hearing that because of, well, two things. One, the people who will buy stuff in your free-to-play games are probably going to be in the cities. Okay, you can challenge me. I'm making assumptions. Challenge me. Challenge me. And it is easier to get at those customers because of the large centers of population. Therefore, you would center your marketing tactics there because you can have them. You can get the eyeballs on your product with people going through the malls and the shopping centers. Am I right, or true or false?
You were correct today. I think that's changing. And we get back to what I was saying earlier about, and again, this is also different per country. So you take Thailand. Come on, everybody lives in Bangkok, right? I mean, that's the huge center. I think it's like a third of the country. But you go to Indonesia, there's 20 or 30 different cities that are over 1 million people. So it's different by country. But what we're seeing when you get excited about growth in Southeast Asia and all of these 50% growth figures, that's not in the cities. The people in the cities already have cell phones. The growth is out in the country. And so I think what you just said is correct probably for the next year. Moving beyond that year, I think that's going to radically change.
Actually, where I see it is that I think you're right about the malls, that you'll actually be able to, you'll also be able to afford offline events in these countries. If we take Thailand as example, an interesting point is that people using credit cards online to buy stuff are all outside Bangkok. Because in Bangkok, there is a 7-Eleven next to your door, there is a mall right in front of you, you can go out, you can buy all the stuff. So if you look at all the e-commerce sites, even though the biggest population are in Bangkok, everybody is ordering from outside the city because they can't get the cool stuff. And this is just an assumption and not a test. It's probably also a lot more boring out there. So you will be playing more games. It's just like when we actually have Religious Day where you're not selling any alcohol and people are not out. We can see a spike. When there's a crisis in Europe, the same way people don't go out, there's a spike in revenue for mobile games. Like, we on the right side of that.
Well, it's a nice segue for me because one of the limiting factors that gets quoted is credit card penetration, is payment issues. So is that being solved? Is that going to get in the way of these lovely hockey stick graphs?
So for us, we actually had internal development of local payments. Our problem is that we are focused very much on a very casual market. And if you are playing a match 3 game like Candy Crush and you need 5 more moves, you're not going to walk down to 7-Eleven to buy a scratch card to enter it in to get your 5 more moves. If you want a new killer sword in Brave Frontier, you might actually walk down there and get it just like you would with your MMO games. So we had to focus a lot on the carrier billing side of it. And yes, before you needed to integrate with local payments, geo-lock it and stuff so Apple and Google wouldn't find out. But actually, you now have Google going in, getting all the carrier billing up for all the Southeast Asian countries. So at least for us in very casual games, we have internally completely skipped anything you have for local payments on those parts because Google can go to a telco and get a lot better deal than we can and still take their commission for their 30%. So for those parts, it's really good for us. Apple is lacking a little bit behind on it. It will hopefully come. That's moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have enough attention from Apple and Google that we try not to hide things from them. So we've been reliant on Google and Apple expanding their payment options and doing deals with the carriers rather than trying to put in that kind of shadow carrier billing system. For us, where we've had a lot of success, not only in the region but globally, is advertising-based monetization. For us, solutions that have very good global fill, like AdMob, AdSense, have been good for us when we're getting that volume in the region. But yeah, we're seeing the problem slowly get solved as those carrier billing deals are being done by the platform manufacturers directly. But yeah, right now most of our revenue is coming in from ads. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to is seeing more local ad providers, ad networks coming out of the region. So you're starting to see people popping up there, more branded campaigns and advertisers using games as a platform. So not only are brands becoming a bigger thing in the Western markets, but that's starting to happen in the secondary markets as well. So I think advertising is going to be more and more viable over time. But like anywhere, in order for that to work, you do need the volume play, and you do need to generate a lot of downloads.
And let's not forget, I mean, maybe they have credit cards now, and maybe there's ads that speak to them, but Procter & Gamble and Unilever, they have to monetize off those ads too, and if it's a guy that makes $200 a month, you're still back to the same core problem of monetizing people who are poor. There's only so much soap you can sell that family, and so that ad sell is going to be a lot cheaper as well. Even if they get credit cards, that doesn't mean the credit card has money on it. So these are problems, but I actually think the larger problem is still going to be how do you figure out how to monetize people who just don't make that much money, and it's going to be games that have a lot of users. I mean, there's not going to get around that.
Let me switch tack for a moment and talk about talent and development talent in the region.
Best in the world.
Where do you see the strengths and weaknesses right now in the development pool, the talent pool in Southeast Asia? I mean, you can talk about your own particular territory, or just make any observation you might see where things are good or where things need to be helped.
You have extremely great talent there. I would say the areas that are strongest are game development, art, animations, all the creative sides of those parts. Where it's lacking, or where we can't hire, or where we hire foreigners. I mean, half of our Bangkok office is actually foreigners, but that's because the server scaling side, the data science, even the marketing is really hard to get, because there's not that many other companies. You don't have like a guy, you don't have a Google with a big server in Thailand or in Philippines where you can actually go and poach people like you can in San Francisco. There's not that many with that big experience of handling millions of users per day, and that's some of the expertise you need to get from outside. The great thing about Southeast Asia is that it's a lovely place to be. So there's also a lot of people that really want to come and work there with you as long as you're solving problems that are big enough.
Some parts of Southeast Asia are lovely places to be.
Bangkok is amazing. That's why.
Yeah, for us, I mean, we're based outside of Southeast Asia, but we certainly get applications from candidates from all around the world. I think where we have hired from the region, it's tended to be, you know, as was mentioned, more illustration, concept art, art in general, a little bit of design. Where we've struggled, I think, and actually where we had issues years ago when we were looking at setting up a studio in Singapore, was on the programming side. We just couldn't find. There are a lot of very competent programmers, but not very creative programmers. So people who couldn't necessarily have both the combination of technical skills but have the ability to problem solve at the same time. I mean, that's kind of what we found. We you know, there was a limitation there. You're there, so.
So, you know, we probably have the most, of this panel, I think we probably have the most diverse Southeast Asian staff. And we have very, very few people outside of Southeast Asia. The people outside of Southeast Asia in our studio are actually almost entirely Russian and Ukrainian. Which, by the way, if you're going to hire programmers, totally Russia, Ukraine, they're like really good. Shout out to my Russian and Ukrainian peeps. But the problems that we find come from two big categories. One is language and the other is experience. They have great schools, they have great skills, they're very smart people, but if you want to go poach somebody from a 10-year-old game dev studio, well, there's two of us, you know. So there's really not a lot of people who you can say, oh, this guy's been making games for 10 years. That guy doesn't exist, and especially on the code side. And code is probably the one place where a long depth of experience means the most, and those, just like he says, they're just not there. And it's not because they're not bright, they just don't have the experience. The other one is language, and that's going to differ by country. So if you go to the Philippines, and this is why I think a lot of people are very excited about the Philippines, their English is as good as mine is. And not just English language, but their understanding of Western culture. They watch the same TV, they listen to the same music. The Philippines is very tuned in to what's going on in the West. If you go to Vietnam or Thailand, yeah, not so much. And those are places that you're going to have language issues, you're going to have cultural issues. If you're making content for outside of the region, you know, if I take a Filipino person and tell them, you know, I want you to make something that looks like Frosty the Snowman, even though they've never had snow in their entire history as a country, they know what Frosty the Snowman looks like. I do the same thing in Thailand. Yeah, good luck with that.
Okay. Henry, you must have had some experience building out studios in the region. How do you see it?
I've tried since I joined Come To Us like 15 years ago. So I set up a studio in Singapore as a regional hub. To echo what everyone else has said, I think right now the biggest weakness is game design. Just partly because poor countries tend to have less luxury to play games, and historically, only rich people can appreciate art, right? You're just trying to survive. So I think there's a long history of why they lacked experience, just because they're not immersed in that culture. But overall, game design has been very weak. I think the client-server stuff we're able to hire better. But unless my colleagues or anybody here knows better, I'm looking for a great game developer to publish in the region internationally, and I've not. I mean, Boomzap is an exception because I know his staff, they're all like fairly international, so that's like an aberration. I mean, like really local staff. I've never, maybe in Vietnam, I've not found a great development studio or great developers personally.
So last question before I open it up to the floor. What's your top piece of advice for succeeding in Southeast Asia? Go.
Remember that anything you will do in Southeast Asia of localizing your content to any of the countries, you will be the pretty girl at the bar because your content will stand out. Google and Apple have people dedicated to Southeast Asia, and they have a very difficult time finding great content. So your featurization for actually doing something will have a much bigger impact right now for that.
Yeah, for me, it's localization. The more you can localize, and this goes for the platform manufacturers in every region, the more localized you are from day one, the more chance of featuring, and the more you have opportunity to get into those special language feature categories. Okay.
I would say be aware of what you're getting into, right? Southeast Asia is not Japan, it's not Korea. We don't have those kind of numbers. And so the amount of work that you're going to have to do to be successful in Southeast Asia versus the expected or potential profits in the next 2 years, if you're expanding in one region, I'm not sure Southeast Asia is the one, right? You might want to put your energies in somewhere where the expected return on investment would be higher, unless you're really dedicated to Southeast Asia. It's not like Japan or Korea where you're doing one language in one country. There's many languages, many countries, many road bumps, many hurdles. You're either in or you're out. It's not something you can do trivially by yourself. If you just want to be in Southeast Asia, there are people who are growing up in this region that will work with you as a partner, and it may be a better idea for you to do that. Hi. That's well done, right? But no, in all seriousness, it's a very diverse, very complicated region, and it's not, a huge success there is not going to make you anywhere near the money that a huge success in, say, Japan would, or China. That's just a fact. So be aware of that going into it.
Well, if you're going to be a local player, then you take advantage of the costs. You could hire good engineers or employees for $300 to $500. So you got to bootstrap it. I mean, Gumi had the choice of being very local. I mean, we have a part of business like that, and then we publish to the West, and we have tons of foreigners earning, almost Silicon Valley pay. So you need to decide if you want to be local, play by local rules. If you want to be international, still take advantage of the local costs, but ultimately, it will be expensive nonetheless.
Well, that's great. Questions from the floor, maybe, for the last 5 minutes. Oh, I thought so. No.
Anybody publishing into Southeast Asia?
Okay, so here's yeah. Can I have a show of hands? Who here wants to take their game into Southeast Asia? Show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Who here?
I like the half hand over there. We haven't quite convinced you, have we?
Not according to these guys. No, I'm just kidding.
Second question, who here is looking for a job in Southeast Asia?
Wow. Tough crowd.
I can't see this on the
Tough
camera.
crowd. Who here is already publishing or is a publisher in Southeast Asia? Ah, the solitary man at the front.
Who here is from Southeast Asia?
There we go. One.
Who here just needed a place to sit down after lunch?
There
it's the room with the Wi-Fi and the aircon.
Yeah. That's right. Who here is now more likely to publish or try and find a partner to take their game to Southeast Asia? Well, that's not bad. 4 5, 4 5. Who is now less likely? Score. There we are. We've done our job. Thank you very much to our panelists.